Your son has a warrant out for his arrest." Hearing those words, my mind went completely blank. What? Why, my son is being arrested? What does this even mean? Questions began swirling in my head, one after another, but none stayed long enough to grasp. I stood frozen in the doorway, speechless, my mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The police officer stepped forward, clearly intending to prevent me from shutting the door. Overwhelmed by the presence of the three large men, I instinctively tried to close the door quickly, anxiety surging through me. "Your son is here, isn't he? May we come in and talk for a bit?" one of the officers asked. "Just a moment, please," I stammered, desperately trying to stop them from entering. I braced against the officer's chest, using every ounce of strength in my legs to hold my ground. "I'm sorry, I really don't understand what's happening. Could you please explain what's going on?" I pleaded, my voice tinged with panic. The officer holding the warrant folded it up and sighed deeply before responding. "It seems he ran away with some cash. The suspect was seen heading towards this house. Someone got a good look at his face, so denying it won't be easy," he said, a faintly triumphant look crossing his face. "Theft, my son." While I felt my mind going blank, I forced myself to listen to the officer's words. Despite the color draining from my face, I firmly replied, "My child would never do something like that. It's absolutely impossible." The officer, clearly tired, gave a dismissive reply, but I was certain. My son wouldn't do such a thing. After all, I was a 50-year-old housewife, living a peaceful life with my husband and son in the house we had built with years of savings. We all got along well, leading a happy life, right in the middle of bliss. But lately I had been feeling worn out. Things hadn't been going smoothly, and when I was alone, worries constantly plagued my mind. "I need to get this done too," I would say aloud, busy without even realizing it. "Well, maybe it's okay to leave it for later," I muttered to myself one day as I turned on the TV in the living room, trying to escape reality. "It's better to take a break sometimes," I told myself, feeling physically exhausted. But even as I watched the daytime drama, the story didn't sink in, and my thoughts remained cloudy. Suddenly, my gaze drifted to the numerous certificates and trophies on the shelf, awards my son Oliver had received for his achievements in soccer. He was truly a son to be proud of. As these thoughts floated through my mind, the doorbell rang. Who could it be? Yes, I muttered, turning down the TV and getting up from the sofa. Maybe it was something from my mother-in-law. Sometimes she sent vegetables to our house without prior notice, saying she found detailed communication bothersome. Or perhaps it was the online order I had placed recently. My son had been using online shopping more frequently, and my husband had also gotten into it. So that was a possibility. Thinking these mundane thoughts, I went to the door without a second thought. If only I had checked the intercom camera, I might have been prepared for what awaited me. But unfortunately, I opened the door without a shred of suspicion. "Yes, I'll open it right away," I said. But the moment the door swung open, I was shocked by the sight before me. "Hello, is this the residence of the Smith family?" "Yes, it is, but you're police officers, aren't you? What can I do for you?" I asked, my voice quivering. There stood 3 officers, just like the ones I often saw on the dramas I watched casually. I was completely taken aback. Seeing police officers, even when I hadn't done anything wrong, made me nervous and tense, as if I had unknowingly caused some trouble somewhere. I gripped the doorknob tightly, my knuckles white, as one of the officers handed me a piece of paper. I couldn't make out what the officer was holding at first, so I squinted, trying to see it more clearly. Then in a cold voice, he spoke. "There's a warrant out for your son's arrest." Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. My mind went completely blank. What? Why? My son is going to be arrested. What does this mean? Has he done something wrong? Questions surged and vanished in my mind as I stood frozen in the doorway, speechless. The officers stepped forward, clearly not intending to let me close the door. Overwhelmed by the presence of the 3 imposing men, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. I tried to close the door quickly, but the officers wouldn't allow it. They pressed their feet against the door, keeping it open. Fear gripped me. "Your son is here, isn't he? May we come in and talk for a bit? If you're not hiding anything, you wouldn't mind letting us in, right?" one of the officers asked, his tone implying suspicion. "Please wait a moment," I stammered, desperately trying to stop them from entering. I pushed against their chests, bracing my feet to keep them out. "Excuse me, I really don't understand what this is all about. Could you please explain what's going on?" I appealed, genuinely confused and frightened. "A warrant. For what exactly?" The officer holding the warrant folded it with a sigh. "Mom, there have been a series of thefts in this area recently. According to witnesses, the suspect looks a lot like your son." "What? The suspect looks like him?" I repeated, stunned. The officer continued, his voice tinged with triumph. "It seems he took off with cash and ran toward this house. People have seen his face clearly, so denying it will be difficult." "Theft? My son? No way." As my mind began to spin, I somehow managed to keep listening to the officer in front of me. He then pulled out another document, unfolded it, and started talking about something that seemed related to its contents. "It appears your son is involved in several theft cases. The total amount of the damage is around $500,000. However, considering his youth, the victims are willing to settle," he said. $500,000? No way, I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief. "My child couldn't have done such a thing. It's absolutely impossible," I exclaimed in shock, but the officer, looking weary, replied, "I understand how you feel. Every parent says the same thing, thinking their child couldn't possibly be involved in theft. However, we need you to prepare the $500,000, and we'll discuss this further with your son." Staring at the officer's face, I reached for the front door, my mind racing. "Could you please wait outside for a moment?" I asked. "No, we'll wait inside," he responded firmly. "I need to use the bathroom. You can't just barge into someone's house without permission while the homeowner is in the bathroom, right? Or can't you wait for just 5 minutes while I go?" I blurted out, grasping at any excuse to buy time. I needed to calm down, and the imposing presence of the officers was overwhelming. More than anything, I wanted to close the door. "Please let me use the bathroom. I'm at my limit. I'll listen to everything properly afterward," I pleaded. The officer hesitated for a moment, which was all I needed. Quickly, I shut the front door. A loud thud followed. Probably the officer knocking or kicking it. But I didn't hesitate. I immediately locked the door. As soon as the lock clicked, a torrent of emotions washed over me: relief, fear, and a flood of questions. "Mom, please open the door." The officer's voice boomed, accompanied by the sound of pounding on the door. Worried about disturbing the neighbors, I slowly moved away from the entrance. "I'll be right back," I called out, rushing to the bathroom. I didn't really need to use it, but I needed a moment to think. Calm down," I muttered to myself, trying desperately to steady my nerves. Gradually, my thoughts began to organize themselves. As I sat on the toilet, my hands trembling as I grabbed some toilet paper, I reassured myself that it was impossible for Oliver to be involved in a crime. It had to be a misunderstanding. Determined, I decided I would face the officers with confidence. After all, I had nothing to hide. About 5 minutes later, after taking a deep breath, I resolved to return to the front door, unlocked it, and faced the officers again. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer called out loudly, but I kept reminding myself to stay calm, no matter what. "Your son hasn't tried to escape in the meantime, has he? Please allow us to search the house," the officer insisted. "He hasn't done anything like that. I'll say it again. My son hasn't committed any theft." "It's impossible," I responded, my voice firm. "Even if you say that, we can't just take your word for it. There are witness testimonies and camera footage. If you cover for your son, you could also be implicated," the officer warned, Camera, you didn't mention that before. I snapped, my suspicion growing. We mentioned it because it seems you won't admit it. There is evidence, the officer replied. Earlier, you said he resembled the suspect, but now you're asserting it's my son. Your story keeps changing, doesn't it? I questioned, feeling increasingly uneasy. Look, ma'am, I understand it's hard to accept. The officer continued, relentlessly pressing on and ignoring my questions. His words lacked consistency and something felt off. The information kept shifting, and it didn't add up. Upon closer inspection, even the police uniforms looked like costumes from a drama. I stared intently at the face of the youngest-looking officer, who quickly averted his gaze when he noticed my scrutiny. Clearly suspicious. Ma'am, enough is enough. We're coming in, the oldest and largest officer declared, pushing past me. Wait, you can't just barge in like that. I protested, trying to block the way, but he shoved me aside effortlessly. I stumbled, falling onto the floor as the officers pushed further into the house. Stop. Don't come in, I shouted, scrambling to my feet to follow them. Don't touch anything. Despite my desperate cries, the officers ignored me, rifling through drawers in the kitchen and living room. Rummaged through everything from one end of the room to the other, leaving a trail of chaos. My stomach churned with anxiety. Stop it, I'm telling you. Hey, I rushed to an officer who was opening a drawer containing mine and my husband's wedding rings and slammed it shut with a loud bang that echoed through the room. There's nothing here. You can't just enter someone's home and go through their drawers. I glared at one of the officers, trembling with anger. It was the younger officer who had averted his gaze earlier. He nodded slightly at me before heading to another room. Eventually, the three officers zeroed in on Oliver's room, clearly identified by the nameplate on the door. Without hesitation, they entered. My son is sleeping in there. Don't go in, I shouted with all my might, but my plea was ignored as the door swung open. We just want to talk, one of the officers called out loudly as they entered, but they suddenly fell silent, all three of them staring toward the bed at the back of the room. Hello. I've heard the conversation. I'm Oliver. The son, my son said, slowly bowing his head toward the officers from his bed. Spreading his arms and smiling, he continued, As you can see, I'm in this condition right now, so there's no way I could commit theft. The officers, momentarily speechless, just stared at him. Oliver was lying in a nursing bed equipped with a pressure sore prevention mattress. Beside the bed stood a wheelchair, and nearby, stacks of towels and a call button were within easy reach. My son was bedridden. I'm sorry, it seems we've made a mistake, said one officer, who had previously spoken in an almost threatening tone, but now wore a rueful smile. Oliver returned the smile slightly. That's right, I'm relieved. I can't move my lower body, so it's impossible for me to steal and run away, he explained, pointing at the wheelchair. I can't even get into that without help. I can't go outside by myself. I see. That was the case. We apologize for our mistake. We'll take our leave now, the officers said awkwardly, nodding their heads as they prepared to leave. Filled with anger, I clenched my fists, wanting to say something. But one officer lingered, approaching Oliver. Hey, he said quietly. What's up? My son replied. What happened to you? Your body? The officer asked, his voice tinged with concern. Steve. Is that you? Oliver looked up at the officer, recognition and joy lighting up his eyes. I approached the youngest officer, suddenly realizing it was Steve, Oliver's childhood friend. Steve? I exclaimed in surprise, covering my mouth with my hand. Steve had been one of Oliver's closest friends since they were kids, sharing a deep passion for soccer. They played together nearly every day from elementary school onward, and had planned to join the middle school soccer club together. But then Steve had to move away suddenly due to his parents' work, and they lost touch. I remember watching you excel at soccer, thinking you'd go pro after college. I even saw you in magazines. But what happened? I asked, unable to hide my shock. Steve, looking visibly shaken, glanced down as Oliver lifted the blanket to reveal his legs, which were motionless. I had an accident a month ago, Oliver said with a sad smile. Now, my lower body doesn't move at all. Seeing the pained expression on Steve's face, Oliver quickly pulled the blanket back over his legs and turned a more genuine smile toward him. But hey, it's really been a long time, hasn't it? You became a police officer, but don't you play soccer anymore? Steve's expression grew complex, and he answered quietly, choosing his words carefully. I didn't have the talent like you, Oliver. Besides, I had other things to worry about. I recalled Steve's difficult family situation. His father, who didn't have a steady job, went out drinking every night. The move wasn't just about his parents' work but also his father's debts. As Steve spoke, his head hung low. Oliver sat up halfway and began to speak encouragingly. What do you mean you had no talent? You were always so hardworking. I was always envious of you, Oliver. You never gave up on anything, and you always looked so cool. I pushed myself because of you. And now, seeing you do your best as a police officer, it gives me strength too, Steve confessed, his voice trembling. I'll do my best, I promise. Next time we meet, let's play soccer together, okay? Even if I'm in this situation, I can still play. There are ways for people with disabilities to play soccer, you know. But Steve didn't respond, keeping his head down, his complexion pale. Hey, are you okay, Steve? Oliver asked. Concern etched on his face. Suddenly, tears began to fall from Steve's eyes, silently dripping onto the floor. Steve, Oliver called out again, his voice filled with worry. Steve struggled to hold back his sobs as he looked up at Oliver. In that tense moment, I noticed the other two officers quietly trying to slip away. Where do you think you're going? I shot them a sharp look, my anger flaring. The officers, caught off guard, exchanged flustered glances. It seems there was a mistake, and we need to conduct further investigations, so we'll be leaving now, one of them stammered, clearly trying to avoid any confrontation. They were attempting to leave without even a word of apology after tearing through our home. Just as I was about to shout at them, Steve spoke up, his voice strong despite the tears. I'm out. The two officers turned to him in confusion. What do you mean, out? One of them demanded. You were the one who said this house was wealthy, Steve continued, his voice shaking but resolute. This is wrong, and you know it. I'll tell everything to the police. A heated argument erupted between the officers and Steve. One of them, driven by anger, lunged at Steve. Wait. I tried to intervene, but fear held me back, and my voice barely registered. The officer's fist connected with a sickening thud, sending Steve staggering to the floor, his cheek swelling from the blow. Another officer kicked him while he was down. Pay the money and clear your father's debt, one of the burly men demanded, his voice dripping with malice. I stood frozen, horror and shock gripping me as I watched their brutality. Despite the pain from the punches and kicks, Steve looked up at the officers and declared, I'll turn myself in. I'm sorry, Oliver. I'm not the person you praised anymore. I've always envied you, your talent, your life, and I hate myself for using my circumstances as an excuse for the terrible things I've done. Don't joke about turning yourself in, snarled one of the fake officers, raising his fist to strike Steve again. But before he could, a sharp voice cut through the tension. Hold it right there. We'd all turned toward the source of the voice, and a wave of relief washed over me as I saw a real police officer in an official uniform, his badge gleaming. The fake officers were swiftly apprehended by the real police. Sorry for the delay. Are you and your son hurt? The real officer asked, concern in his voice. No, we're okay. Somehow, I replied, still shaken. Earlier, while in the bathroom, I had secretly called the police, reporting that 3 men claiming to be officers were in my house. Their suspicious behavior had prompted me to contact the real authorities. "Come quietly," the real officer ordered as the impostors resisted arrest but were quickly subdued. Steve, who had been sitting on the floor, was helped up by one of the officers. He'd offered no resistance as he was led away. "Steve," Oliver called out. Steve stopped, turned back to us, and with deep regret in his eyes, he apologized before leaving with the officer. Oliver watched his friend's retreating figure until he was out of sight. After the house was cleared and many questions were answered that day, we began the process of cleaning up the mess the impostors had left behind. I waited anxiously for my husband's return. Despite his demanding job and the long commute, he hurried back as soon as he could, apologizing repeatedly for not being able to contact us sooner. I reassured him that we were safe and that was all that mattered. Later, we learned more about what had happened with Steve. Steve was the only one of the three to confess to the police. It turned out that they were high school acquaintances who had become involved in a string of thefts in the area. Their scheme targeted wealthy families, falsely accusing their children of theft and extorting money from panicked parents. The fake arrest warrant was their own creation, and the police uniforms were nothing more than costumes. This tactic had worked for them, until this incident led to their arrest. Steve had initially worked hard to pay off his family's debts, but as the interest kept piling up and he couldn't keep up with the payments, he reluctantly agreed to participate in this scheme. He was told that if he provided information about the affluent area where he used to live, a portion of his debt would be reduced. That's why they knew so much about our town, and why their crimes had gone undetected for so long. In the end, all of them were arrested and held accountable for their actions. Their attempt to deceive people by impersonating police officers and entering homes without permission resulted in particularly severe penalties. When my son Oliver heard the news, he wasn't disturbed. Instead, he decided to turn himself in, believing in the goodness still within Steve. "I knew it. He's essentially a good guy," Oliver said, nodding and smiling as he listened to me. "It's surprising they weren't caught earlier, especially with those disguises." "Did you know from the start that they weren't real cops, Oliver?" "Yeah," Oliver replied, claiming to be a cop with such an untrained physique. Steve used to be much fitter. I could tell something was off right away. He later shared that he had noticed other suspicious details, like how Steve wouldn't meet his eyes, and how his voice, though different, reminded him of his old friend. "I wonder how long it will be before he can come back," Oliver mused. "It's not confirmed yet, but don't worry. He'll bounce back. He's still the same guy he used to be," Oliver said with certainty. A month later, on a quiet morning, I brought breakfast to Oliver's room. "Good morning, Oliver," I greeted him. "Morning, Mom. Did it arrive today?" Oliver asked, his mind on something else before even thinking about breakfast. I nodded and handed him a simple envelope. "You're more concerned about Steve than breakfast, huh?" I teased gently. "Yes," Oliver admitted, carefully opening the letter from Steve. "What does Steve say?" "He wants to play soccer together. He's been staying active over there," Oliver shared, a smile spreading across his face as he read the letter. Seeing him so happy, I couldn't help but smile too. Beside Oliver was a new type of wheelchair designed specifically for playing soccer. After everything that had happened, Oliver had decided to start training in power chair soccer. His determination was extraordinary. He immediately set his sights on playing soccer with Steve again. Watching him, I made up my mind. Even if there were hardships ahead and things didn't always go smoothly, I would live my life to the fullest, inspired by my always smiling son who faced his challenges with such a positive attitude. Today, I felt like I could accomplish anything I set my mind to.